Hi guys, welcome back to Spill the Tea. This is technically episode 3, but I'm basically going to start a new series. I do have a professor with me from ASU. Her name is Cynthia Storm. She was my GIT 540 professor over my last semester, and I reached out to her to kind of join me to kind of maybe get started with the whole process of kind of getting into like a bit of an introduction into the master's course that I'm a part of, which is the UI UX course. I'm trying to do this course as a kind of behind the scenes or kind of just like getting to understand what's happening in these master's courses. So because I felt like there was a bit of a bridge in terms of like the information that people understand of what happens in these courses. So I reached out to a few professors and decided to start this series. So without further ado, today's guest is Cynthia Storm. She's an experienced user designer. She's an educator. She's also an entrepreneur. She teaches graphic design and web design in ASU. She does a lot of accessibility and graphic information technology work in the Polytechnic campus. She's got over 14 years of experience. She has a background running her own branding and web studio. She has like deep experience with a lot of sociocracies and a lot of NGOs. If I'm saying that right, I'm not too sure. But yeah, so like she brings a rare blend of creative craft, real world client work, and people-centered thinking into the classroom, and that's where her expertise lies. Thank you, Professor. Thank you for taking time off your schedule to join me on this episode, and really looking forward to the conversation that we're about to have.
Thank you. My pleasure. Glad to be here.
So, for people who may not know what UX design is or are planning to get into it, it's basically a pretty fancy term for web design or app design. We try and kind of design a lot of these spaces, be it like a web design or an application on your phone, cater to the people that we design for, and it's essentially a broad platform because everything right now is online. Every single company that you know, be it a car company to all the way to like a restaurant, they always need like an online platform so that people kind of understand what they do, get a background, or like it's a place where people can tell their story per se. It kind of aligns a lot with what I'm doing right now in terms of like a podcast as well, because we essentially try and tell stories of different people. So today's episode is kind of focused on Professor Cynthia and her background and how she kind of went about the whole process of starting her own like a branding company and also a printing company along with like photography work. So it kind of covers a lot of these topics, and we kind of get into a little bit of details. So without further ado, I think we can just start with the questions. Unless, Professor, if you have anything you'd want to add about yourself, or we can just get started with the questions.
Well, let's go ahead and get started.
All right. So you started in fine photography and visual art long before UX was a mainstream term. Could you tell us what originally drew you into visual communication and design?
Yeah, actually, my father had his own advertising agency that his parents actually started. So you could say that it kind of runs in the family. Um, so all my formative years growing up, my dad was Herald Storm Advertising, and so they did not just print media, but they also did radio and television and all that fun stuff. I am more interested in the print and then later the web, you know, the actual design stuff. I'm more of a visual person, so that's how I kind of got started.
Okay, so do you feel like was there any sort of like, I wouldn't say force, but do you think that your dad possibly was someone who was just like, hey, maybe you want to get into print design and that's something that you want to get into? Or was it just natural for you to kind of lean towards that because you saw your father work with a lot of this work and that itself naturally drew you to it?
Well, what's really funny, when I was in high school getting ready to go off to college, I was like, I want to do fine art. I'm not going to be doing commercial art. I was
Okay.
a bit of a snob. And so, yeah, so my undergraduate degree is in visual art. And then I got into the photography side of things, and that was my medium. I still love photography and building a dark room. I that's my jam. But then as I got married, and I was married to a Marine, so we were moving all the time.
Hmm.
And so I realized I kind of had to create my own thing, and realized that commercial art was not so bad. So with that in mind, and of course my dad was super proud, and of course my company had to still have the Storm name in there. Um, I think at some point he thought maybe I could take over Herald Storm advertising. That wasn't going to happen. I needed to do my own thing. So Storm Graphic Arts was born.
Okay. So speaking of photography, I also do have like a bit of a passion for photography. I mean, although I haven't had the resources to actually get my own like professional grade camera, I try and do a lot of like just mobile photography and kind of push the limits with that. Kind of talking about for photography and then your transition into print and UX. You've lived through multiple shifts from print to web design to UX to accessibility. Can you tell me what has helped you evolve every time instead of getting stuck in one of those areas of design?
Yeah. I think part of it is every time we moved, I had to reinvent myself in a way. Um, and I, for me, it's all about expanding and knowing and being able to add to my skill set, you know. So there was never going to be any kind of getting stuck because there was always the next thing to add, if that makes sense. Um, yeah, and then on top of that, I watched my dad, and he had to move from paste up, you know, drawing,
Hmm.
literally drawing and paste up into computers. And that was a tough transition for him, but he did it. And he was not afraid of doing that. And so I still remember trying to teach him InDesign when InDesign first came out, and he really struggled with it. But he worked really hard, and
Hmm.
eventually, you know, he was able to make that transition. So if he can make that just transition, which is much bigger than any transitions that I'm making, you know,
Yeah.
even going with UX and accessibility, it's all really related. So yeah.
So I feel like that also kind of resonates with a lot of people because I myself had to make like a transition because I was an architect by profession, learned it for 5 years, worked for about 5 years after, and then kind of decided like I could see the the trend in like the general market where everything was moving towards tech, and I realized that I would want to make that transition now rather than later, just because of that experience of like maybe finding it a little harder to switch at a later point in time. And also, obviously, with my family and everything, there's always that conversation of like, hey, I know that we have done this. It is a parallel to architecture because a lot of the base properties that we learn in architecture school is kind of replicated even in kind of some of the stuff that we learned last semester, especially in GIT 540, where Professor Cameron kind of ran through a lot of like the principles of design and like the history of design. I kind of related to a lot of that because that kind of ran parallel exactly to what we were taught in architecture. So I feel like that conversation with my parents was obviously something which was quite stressful at the time, because not knowing what they would say and just being understanding of like, oh, you're making that transition. So I completely understand. I feel like that the breaking of that fear, I for 100% is the way to kind of move forward because I feel like once you kind of make the leap, that's when you just start figuring things out because you're already in that space, right? Then you have no other choice but to kind of just figure it out. So I totally resonate with what you're talking about it. And kudos to your dad also for making that switch and kind of learning in design. That's really cool. I know a lot of people who are probably like hard stuck in their ways to be like, no, I just know it this way. I'm not really going to change it up. So that's pretty impressive. Um, kind of it's kind of in the same line of what we were talking about earlier because I understand that you had the storm photography. Um, so you could say that you've helped small businesses and organizations establish or kind of revitalize their brand. So can you share a project where you saw design directly impact the client's business or community presence that they had?
Yeah. I was actually recently going through all of my old work and came across a campaign that I did for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, their immigration and migration committee. And so this is like enormous organization, and they have lots of committees that do it. And I'm not Catholic, but I happen to get this job. And they were doing a postcard campaign where it was a single sheet with 3 postcards that each postcard was pre-written. There were images, and they were addressed to representative and senators. And that was many years ago. And so these went out to communities all over the US, so that people could pick this up, address it, send it in. I feel like that was a really strong, impactful process. Just, I mean, for me, learning about, having the images handed to me that were very compelling, and then knowing that some of my work was going all over the US to help support people and to, help make a difference in our greater community. So maybe that was more impactful for me, but I like to think that it was really impactful for the larger community.
Was it ever like, were they like people or names that of people that you probably just heard about online or like on the news, and then after that you kind of associate your work with them? Was that ever like a feeling of just like surprise or like proud? I'm not too sure. It depends, I guess, on whether you kind of maybe agree with the terminologies that they're saying. But I mean, there are a lot of like people that tend to kind of resonate with the mass public, and obviously, if you're working with those specific people, there could be a way that your work kind of influences or kind of adds to the kind of impact that they have. So, do you think that was something that you were able to achieve with the work, or was it like different?
I would say that that's probably more the case for more recent work that
Okay.
I've done with, particularly in the world of sociocracy, um, because sociocracy, like, we all know what democracy is, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's governance by the people. Sociocracy is governance by people who are in relationship. And so it's, I've gotten very involved in that in the last several years, and I do feel like that is making a huge difference. It's not as much design work, although there is quite a bit of design work involved sort of on the periphery. Um, but it is, I hope, impactful in, I'm part of an international network that, we're all working to try to help people be more involved in their governance. So,
Okay. You did speak about like this international presence, about all of this. Kind of talking about like that and global perspective. Do you see any parallels between like hosting exchange students? Because I know that's something that you had done in new environments, because obviously coming to the US for them might be like very different, and it's like a whole culture shock for some people. And onboarding a lot of these users into unfamiliar digital products is kind of like a parallel between the two. Do you think that there was any parallels between that, or do you think they kind of just sit separately, although they just sound similar?
well, I like that visual, actually. I really like to think of those two things as being related. And so, teenagers, when they they tend to just jump right in, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're just going to go and they're going to figure it all out. And oftentimes they did or do. There's still exchange students coming to the U.S. And and I feel like as UX designers, our job is to make it possible for anyone to do that in, whether we're looking at a website or an app or even a physical product. Our job is to make it easy for someone to just jump right in and understand what it is they're getting into. We used to do orientations for the students, and it's like, okay, you're going to be going back home, and this is what it's going to be like. This was at the end of their year, and we tried to help them understand that you're a different person now that you're going back home. You've had this huge experience. And I like to think that we made it easier for them to go home, and these orientations were really helpful. But in the ideal world, someone going into a new platform or a new design shouldn't necessarily need an orientation. They need to be able to jump right in and do it. So that's what UX really is all about in my mind. Make it easy.
I do understand that. But, I also do think that there is a huge like cultural aspect to UX design because they kind of do go like hand in hand. So especially for like international people, like for myself, I kind of grew up in the Middle East. So for me, even though I'm from India, I grew up in the Middle East. So I kind of grew up with a lot of the Western culture. So for me personally, I didn't really have much of a shock kind of coming to the US. And since I grew up with a lot of it, I was able to relate to a lot of the kind of the small innuendos that they come up with, like in certain ads or whatever it is. So for me, it was easier to understand what you're talking about. But then for international students who are coming here for the first time, who probably don't have much experience with this culture, do you think that getting into college would be like that ideal kind of gradual transition to it? Because rather than just kind of jumping straight to work, because I feel like in college you do have the option of kind of gradually getting to know what's happening, and then you have professors kind of guiding you, like how you did with me and our class in GIT 540, kind of guide them to understand like that's how the work is here, and that's kind of the principles of it, kind of relating it to it internationally and as like a whole, but also kind of talk about how it is based on your own background, because that's where you'd have all the information, right?
Right, right. And it is, you know, I was working with high school students, and so high school students have a very different um, level of maturity. We'll call it that, than college students. And I will say that the students that I have worked with that are international students at ASU have had just a completely different level of that maturity and that sophistication and being able to um, adapt and figure out what's what.
Hmm.
I love working with all the international students. It's one of my favorite things. Um, and learning about, because there are cultural differences, and it's so important that we understand one another's cultural differences and not just say, oh no, you're in the United States, you have to learn what I tell you to learn.
Yeah.
I would much prefer that give and take. I want to learn as much as I want to teach. So, um, yeah,
Okay.
that's, yeah.
That makes sense. Um, so now I kind of want to switch to kind of the main topic that where I'm trying to cover here in the podcast and like the series that we've started is basically about UX primarily. So this is kind of talking about UX, accessibility, and current practice pertaining to you, obviously. So when you're working on a project, like a UX project today, what does your process look like from, we have a problem, like from the initial point to we have validated that solution for that specific problem?
Well, I mean, really, it's all about research, right? You've
Hmm.
got to really understand what the problem is. Um, One of the words that is often used in this field is intuitive. We want to make something intuitive. And I push back against that word because what is intuitive to you is not necessarily intuitive to me.
True.
And so and that may seem kind of like a silly distinction, but we are designing for, well, we were just talking, lots of different cultures, lots of different ages, lots of different, perspectives and points of view. And so in our research, we need to be sensitive to that. And we need to gather all of that information that we possibly can to make sure that our designs are not necessarily intuitive, but they're logical and they make sense regardless of your culture and regardless of your background and level of education. So there are a lot of steps. There are a lot of steps. And so much of it is being able to say, you know what, I was wrong. I was wrong, and we need to step back and figure out what will work for everyone, which is a very challenging thing.
For sure. Yeah.
Whether you're making decisions for a community or you're, making decisions about a web platform, it's tricky.
So do you feel like a lot of so the thing is the research work also tends to be focused on certain specific, I wouldn't go as far as to call them biases, but they are kind of focused towards a certain idea that the person who's conducting the research does, right? So is there a way that when you're looking at that research, you have to still look at the research objectively and kind of understand that that's what's happening and then kind of mold what you're reading towards the solution that you're trying to provide?
Yeah, I mean, every designer is going to design for themselves first.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's intuitive to me, so it has to be intuitive to everyone else, right? And so, yeah, I mean, we have to step back, and sometimes that means just walking away for a bit and then coming back with fresh eyes. Sometimes it means handing it to your 90-year-old mother and saying, so what do you think? And seeing what she can do, which probably is not much, at least, yeah. But it's important to get different perspectives and to be willing to hear those different perspectives. And I think a lot of people do get really caught up in their own, the tint of their own glasses, whether they're rose-colored or not.
Yeah.
They are looking at something from their own perspective, and that's where we have to just push back and say, you're not the only person using this. It's not all about you. And that's sometimes hard to hear. Mm-hmm. But it's a process, and it's a process that we all have to continue to work on. Getting into accessibility is relatively new for me, and I've learned so much. And, the fact that people think of usability and accessibility as two different things when no, because if it's not accessible,
it's not usable. Yeah.
So it's important to be able to get all of those perspectives.
Just one final question in the same line of what we were talking about. I understand that a lot of designers, when they're kind of finding a solution, maybe not designers, let me rephrase that. A lot of students that are doing like UX design and kind of doing their masters, a lot of them try and initiate their designs based on their experiences, which is technically designing based on what they think is right. Would that be an ideal start point for them to do something like that and then kind of shift the focus towards what like the nature or the audience that you're designing for? Because sometimes you could say that the decision that you're coming up with could be right, or do you think that it's just best to like keep your preferences as like maybe like a drawing or like a sketch just on the side to kind of direct where you want to go, but then you still start with the audience focus, and that's only where you start from.
Well, the fact is you've got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
You've got to start somewhere. Sometimes that's starting where the platform currently is. And sometimes that's scrapping the whole thing and starting something new. But, you know, and this gets back into that silly word. The We need things to be familiar
Hmm.
in order for them to be usable. And so that goes into that research piece as well. I mean, a lot of people, it's like, okay, scrap it. We're going to start something completely new. Well, if it's too new, then people aren't going to be able to use it. So, oh, it's so inventive to let's put the menu at the bottom of the page. Really? No.
Yeah.
So being able to understand there are standards in play here, and we yes, we want to be inventive and creative and explore what we can explore, and often we come up with solutions that no one thought about, and they are the right solution, right? But we also have to be sensitive to what is already out there. And so, sometimes that is starting with your own perception and your own biases. And also recognizing that they are your biases and they are your culture, influenced by your culture and influenced by by your world.
True.
So, yeah, little side note here. I'm involved with the design, read, the prototyping of the English version of a new game.
Okay.
The game was designed in Germany, and I have an English version, and it is very German. It's very German,
Yeah.
and culturally, this is being tested in the U.S., Canada, UK, in India, in Australia, and every single one of those cultures is discovering something that does not work in their culture, and it's all different.
Yeah.
And so that's been a really interesting experience with this. It's a board game essentially, and it's very German. And that's
Okay.
not to say that's not neither good nor bad. It's just
Yeah.
culturally speaking, it's very different than what the American experience would be with that game.
Yeah, I can understand it being like I feel like a lot of times when games are defined by certain cultural backgrounds, if that specific background is kind of publicized already or it's like known information, like for example a lot of people get into like Greek mythology, a lot of people get into like the history of like Japan and like the whole situation that happened before, so there is some sort of knowledge, and if that exists then maybe you're kind of targeting that niche, but then it still has to be kind of understood by the mass because you're trying to release it to everybody and everybody has to understand it. So I totally understand what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Kind of circling back to how when it comes to like teaching, right? We talked about how international students find it difficult, or may not find it difficult, maybe just kind of blend in with the way of teaching here. When you think about your classes, like GIT 542, where they talk about usability and UX, GIT 540, the one that you had taught me, where you talk about cross-media design solutions, and others. What do you hope students kind of like walk away with that they can't really get from like YouTube or like a boot camp? Because obviously there are a lot of people who are out there just be like, hey, you don't really need to do this. You can just watch this YouTube video. You're gonna get all the information you need, and then after that you can just start working on it, practice it 1,000 times, and you can get it. But what would you say that the classes provide that that you just don't get from like YouTube videos or like a boot camp?
Well, for me, with my classes, what I hope is it's actually the one-on-one support, because I love being able to get onto a Zoom call with a student and talk through whatever it is they need or want to talk through. I'm an online professor only. I only teach online. I would love to be in the classroom, but I don't live in Arizona. Um, but one of the things that I do when I am creating design work is I create these lovely little videos where I walk people through their design and provide feedback. I hope people find that valuable. Um, and, in all of the online classes that I took, and before I got started my business, I took classes from probably one of the very first online schools in design. And I never had any of that. It was all, I just kind of fumbled along and I kind of got maybe a little bit of written feedback, but not really all that much. And I think I was very fortunate because I had my dad,
Yeah.
right? Um, but being able to actually interact with students, you're not going to get that from, YouTube or a boot camp. You're just not. You're going to get more, the classes can be more tailored to your needs as a student in an environment like what ASU provides. Yeah, and actually right now I'm working with another professor to rework one of the classes so that it is more tailored depending on whether or not you're in a UX track or a GIT track or a development track. And that is very, very rewarding work as well. So,
Yeah, I totally understand. I feel like the same was for me as well because initially, actually, I was supposed to be a part of the online students for GIT 540, but I did go and speak to Professor Cameron on like the first day of class, and I'm just like, hey, I know that I've been registered as an online student. I've spoken to the professor with my TWC class, and I told him that, hey, if it's okay, I can just come to the second set of classes, which happens pretty much just after the one that I was assigned. I was just like, hey, if I can come through the earlier set so that I can kind of attend the other class in person, I'd really appreciate it. Luckily for me, both of them accepted, and I was able to attend the class. It was really great. I mean, like honestly, having Professor Cameron and yourself also kind of always available on Slack just to kind of push ideas, kind of just get like a feedback, like a quick feedback about like what's happening and whether this is the right way to move forward or if it's maybe I'm just like walking the wrong direction, obviously, like because you need that guidance somewhere or the other. And totally agree with the fact that in YouTube videos you do learn things. It's not that you don't, but then when you do have certain questions, you're then kind of you're kind of limited to asking the internet again in terms of what you're trying to get. Whereas when you do have an actual physical person that you can talk to, that's going to be the best solution. And then especially if it's a professor who's kind of focused on the topic that's being discussed, they're always ready with answers for what you have, rather than kind of springing that question on to some UX designer who's probably working and they're just like, I'm not too sure what you're trying to get from this, and they might give you some sort of like broken answer probably, and then which may or may not resolve your issues. So I totally understand. That makes total sense. I feel like it was pretty interesting. Like, did you ever like when you were doing like the studies for UX? Was there any time where you actually went to your dad and been like, "Hey, this is something that I created. What's your input?" Or like, if you were a professor, what would you say? Was that something that you did?
well, my dad passed in 2014.
Oh, okay.
So by the time I was working in UX, he was gone.
Oh, sorry.
Um, yeah. But earlier on in my career, in my business, I certainly would ask him for his opinion on different designs and especially if he was part of my target market, right? Um, so yeah, I mean, I definitely had those. those interactions, often the teaching side of things was the other direction because he was learning the computer and he was having a hard time learning that. So that was often, it went the other direction often with him, but certainly I tapped into his, you know, 50 plus years of experience.
Okay. All right. Kind of, we've covered talking about like work and also how we work in classes. Uh, I'm trying to create like a bridge between like the industry and classroom because that's kind of like the next step. Like the moment you're done with your master's, the next step is kind of working in the industry. So you've mentioned students that building portfolios and working on like capstone projects. Um, what patterns do you see in portfolios that feel industry ready versus ones that pretty much just need more work for it to be industry ready?
Yeah, so much of it is attention to detail. And I, when I'm working on a design, sometimes, so my son is 28 and he's also very creative and I have asked him for his thoughts often. And he will say, Mother, you're getting fiddly, because he'll see me like, oh, it just needs to be ooched over just a little bit. And Mother, you're getting fiddly. And so I would say it's the folks who get fiddly that are industry ready. So it's about that attention to detail. Proofreading is not just about text. It's about looking at the entire design. Does that line up? Are those the same size? Do they need to be a lot different in size? Is that the same shade? I mean, all of these kinds of things need to be evaluated again and again and again until you get it just right. And so, yeah, if you're fiddling, you're industry ready. How's that?
No, for sure. I feel like that's also something that has to be kind of learned. It's not something that a lot of people, for how much ever you can view a lot of things, this is including myself. I'm going to be very self-critical here. The spacing, a lot of times, is something that I tend to probably overlook when it comes to like a lot of my designs at the moment. And I've had to be like very purposeful in terms of like, okay, if I'm doing this, the spacing is something that I really need to focus on because a lot of times we tend to go by looks and be like, oh, that kind of looks like it's good. But then if you actually look at the spacing, there may be like a 1 point or a 2 point difference. And in our eyes, that probably isn't much. But then when you're then showing it to a recruiter or a UX professional, they're going to see that instantly because they've just been looking at wireframes and different projects so much that that tiny spacing that we may consider like pretty trivial to them that could be like the main thing to kind of distinguish between like, all right, this person's actually not focused on that, and that's like the main issue, and those are the things that we need people to look at because obviously like people work with a lot of like guidelines in terms of their projects, in terms of like, all right, there's going to be a guideline as to how we create work for a specific client. The main part that we focus on are these fiddly details that you're talking about, and a lot of times missing those details could be that difference. And I've definitely had a lot of back and forth with Professor Cameron about this as well, and a lot of the work that he's done. And when he was reviewing my portfolio, he did mention the same thing about like, look at those details. Those details are where you're gonna make that difference. So I totally understand. That makes a lot of sense coming from personal experience. Although I probably shouldn't be saying that, but you know, it's good to be self-critical, I guess.
Self-aware. Let's call it self-aware.
Self-aware, yeah. Um, we've kind of gone through a lot of the kind of topics that we've wanted to discuss, and I feel like we've covered a lot of ground. There is one thing that is the main difference for a lot of people, which I've seen is basically philosophy. And I know that each person has their own philosophy based on how the different experiences that they've had that mold their journey towards being like a designer or whatever it is their career is in. For students and like early career designers listening, especially for those who don't really have a straight path like myself, is there any advice which could give them some sort of encouragement that you could possibly give them? Because I feel like a lot of the narrative for UX design currently is just like, oh, like, the market's very saturated. There are a lot of people getting into it, and like the market isn't that great. But it's a really, really interesting field because it dives into so much research work along with just general practice where like a lot of times like in architecture at least I can say that there was research but it wasn't as much research as we would require to do in UX design. I understand that there is requirements for research in terms of like just designing for the users, but architects tend to work intuitively, like you've mentioned, with like their past experiences and like what we can do and how that would work. We have defined set guidelines and we work with those, but yeah, like I feel like the research part of it is a lot more exorbitant in UX design than it is in other design fields, at least that I know of. I'm pretty sure if there's a graphic designer or somebody outside of the design realm that I'm speaking of, probably mentioning on the comments, just like, hey, actually, that's not true. I've done a lot of research for my work, so I'm not trying to put down any of the other ones. I'm just relating from my experiences. But is there any sort of advice, kind of circling back to the question, is there any advice you'd give to early designers or like students currently in like the UX field of study?
Um, I mean, it's true. It is a saturated field. It is you have to have a level of that attention to detail, a willingness to do the research. Um, but as far as if someone is kind of trying to figure out what their path is, I mean, like I said earlier, I had to reinvent myself like every time we moved. And so I've had so many different career paths, it's a little ridiculous. Um, and and often I think that we lose sight of the opportunities to bridge our interests. And so, you know, I have I have created work for myself in at different times, and sometimes that's what we have to do. Um, I, I the term serial entrepreneur has resonated with me over the years. It's like, oh, well, I'll just make a job for myself, um, and and that often will work. You know, you have different interests in different areas, and being able to pull those together along with that UX understanding and experience, you're going to be able to create something that you're passionate about because it fits with your interests, and you're not going to be the only one who has that interest. And so you're going to be able to provide a product or a service for other people. And, sometimes people worry about becoming too niche. And, if you're all by yourself, that can be a little intimidating. But at the same time, there is someone else out there that is interested in that same thing. Um, and you just have to be very persistent and willing to go out on a limb. And some people don't have the financial security to be able to do that, and I recognize that that's a privilege that I have had over the years. But we're all taking risks in this lifetime, and we all have to kind of weigh that risk benefit piece in figuring out where you're going to forge your own path and where you're going to look for the road that's fairly well trodden. and go down that path with other people. So I don't know that I really answered your question,
No,
but
I think it does. Although maybe I'm not sure. Was it Robert Frost that the one that said the road less taken? I feel like we're kind of going against. He's probably rolling in his grave right now. But but I think that's true. I feel like it would be a good idea to kind of have a sort of structure. I think that does give you a little bit of a structure, right, to kind of work with. And then at the end of the day, I think it's just about how competitive you are with those people because I think this is that point that you made about there's always somebody probably doing the same thing or interested in the same thing. I think that does resonate along a lot of careers, be it like even like athletics and stuff like that. You always hear it. Like I tend to listen to a lot of these motivational speeches of people, and they always talk about how there's always going to be somebody who does what you're doing better than you. The point is, how can you beat or how can you compete against them and possibly even beat them and kind of take that step forward. So that's kind of the way that you're going to do it. So maybe if I were to probably add into what you were talking about is to try and find a theme that you're interested in that you can focus on because that's something that I've heard from my family members. I have a cousin brother who lives in New York. He's a graphic designer and he works for like a marketing firm. And I've kind of ran the same question through him in terms of like, hey, I'm trying to get into the field right now. So what do you think is something that you're going to look for? How can I kind of differentiate myself from people who already exist? And just, I don't want to be part of like just one amongst like the masses of people who are trying to kind of apply. And his main point at the time was to find the theme and kind of revolve your work around it. It doesn't necessarily have to be just one straight line, like it has to be the same thing over and over again. It's kind of finding that thread that you can kind of pull through all of those individual pieces that can kind of tie it together and then create that storm and then kind of work from there and then kind of take it to companies that you're taking from. So I do understand. I think that kind of revolves around the same thing, give or take, if I've said so correctly.
yeah, yeah. And if you're not interested in being an entrepreneur, that's fine. But you still have to brand yourself and figure out what is your unique twinkle that makes you you in order to, sell that to a potential employer, right? And it may or may not have anything to do with your research abilities or your design skills. It might be, that you happen to also have an interest in, you know, Robert Frost or whatever it is. So being able to embrace your interests along with your career path, I think, is important.
Okay. I feel like we've covered quite a lot of the conversation, and I've taken already quite a bit of your time. I want to be respectful of the fact that you probably have other things to do and kind of work to get to. I do have one question though. This is like a usual ending segment question that I tend to ask all the people that have kind of taken part in my podcast. It's basically if you had to say something to yourself 5 years from now, like 5 years in the future, is there something like 5 years down the line, maybe you could kind of look back to this video and then just see or like try and answer the questions that you're asking yourself? So, what would you want to say to yourself 5 years from now?
Yeah, yeah, that's true. I mean, I think that looking back, what I would want to be able to say was my legacy or my stamp on the world is that I made a difference and that I was able to teach someone something of value, whether it was helping an exchange student acclimate to the US or exploring something new or learning how to look at a design more critically or how to make a larger impact on the community. um, I have realized over all of these different careers that I've had that teaching is where I belong.
Hmm.
and I feel like I feel very solid in what I'm doing now. Um, and it took a lot of different paths to get here. Um, but it was all those different paths and all that different experience that I had that have added value to what I can teach. And so what I would say to myself 5 years from now, to myself, would be maybe, you know, don't stop exploring, don't stop learning new things. It's never, you're never done learning. You're never done learning. And I, I know that I learn from my students just as much as I teach. And if I'm not doing that, then I'm not in the right place, because information is back and forth, right? So being able to to continue to learn, I think, is probably the most valuable thing we can do. Um, yeah, and I mean, my experience with different cultures and with whether it's exchange students or international, all the different international, organizations I've been involved with, it's a lot of that is part of my learning. And I love to travel, and that also is part of that learning. So I don't know.
That's fine. Maybe 5 years from now, we can do like a short like video where you probably watch yourself talk about this, and then we can kind of do like maybe a response to that and just kind of take it from there. I'm pretty sure that you're going to do exactly as you've mentioned, because I know that you're a great professor. I've always loved having you kind of talk to you and kind of have you respond to like a lot of the things that we discuss. So I really appreciate you taking the time, Professor. I know that this was a large ask in terms of taking like a whole hour continuously for you, but I really, really appreciate you taking the time. And I hope that I'm not sure when this video would be out, but when you do, I hope that you would look at it fondly and then enjoy the fact that you're there. And this is gonna be forever, so you'll always have like one part of yourself from 2026 always on, like for you to probably like get back to and kind of look at. So thank you so much,
Okay.
Professor. I hope you have a lovely weekend. And also say hi to the dog. I saw him off the corner of the screen. He's so cute. But yeah, I hope you have a lovely evening. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you. This was
Okay.
fun. I appreciate it.